now welcoming me. Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Ann's, and today we're going to talk about embracing change, all about Article 2. So, the UUA, as part of their living tradition, is reviewing Article 2. So let's start with the obvious. What is Article 2? It is our 7 principles and 6 sources, as well as our purpose, our inclusion statement, and our freedom of belief declaration. When someone asks you what's a UU, most of us will hand them one of those cards we have on the back there and rattle off our purposes and principles. So it's very much a part of our identity, who we are, and that's precisely why we're talking about it today. Now, we don't have time to review all of these sections. The long history of the changes in their denomination, how we are adapting them for a new generation. Reverend Johnson, in his vast knowledge of UU history and experience, is going to go over that in a future sermon. My job today is just to talk about change. How do we feel about change? And how do we process this change? As I said, these principles have been a core part of our identity, these particular ones since 1985. And change, of course, can be difficult. It is a loss. It's important to remember that we are in the middle of these changes. And nothing is final, and everything is open for discussion. Right now, it's more about the process than it is about the principles themselves. So I invite you to start by taking a deep breath. We're going to listen to some speakers today who will share with us where we are in this process. The Article 2 Commission has asked all congregations to review Article 2, so let's begin with their introduction to the Commission.
Hello, Unitarian Universalists. I am Rob Spurko.
I'm Satya Mandani.
I am Reverend Cheryl M. Walker.
And I serve
as
an Article 2
Study Commissioner.
As co-chair of your Article 2 Study Commission.
For the past 2 years, your Article 2 Study Commission has engaged thousands of Unitarian Universalists in theological reflection and thoughtful discernment
about what is at the heart of our living tradition.
We were inspired by the passionate responses people gave about the future of our faith community. And we heard so much consensus and faithful expression of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist.
All of these conversations informed our proposal for a new Article 2, which was submitted to the UUA board in January.
You can view a video of our presentation and a shorter clip of us reading the proposal on the UUA's YouTube channel.
You can get a copy of the full written report on UUA.org by searching for Article 2. This has been some of the most meaningful work of my life, and I have been honored to serve this faith that I love through this work.
Now that the Article 2 proposal is public, we encourage every Unitarian Universalist congregation to be a part of the review process.
We invite you to reflect on the Study Commission's proposal and hope that this process helps us all connect more deeply to our faith and theology.
At General Assembly this June, congregational delegates will consider amendments to the proposal.
Delegates will also vote on whether to extend consideration of this proposal for another year.
If the proposal and any amendments receive majority support at GA this year,
then the Article 2 Study Commission will integrate the amendments and submit a final proposal for congregation to study and consider throughout the next year.
We invite all of you to actively participate in these essential conversations.
In doing so, you will be shaping Unitarian Universalism not just for the present, but for our future.
Please explore the proposal for a new Article 2 and engage it as a congregation and with your delegates.
We are so grateful to be part of this process with you.
In support of the Unitarian Universalist tradition we all love.
We hope your congregation will join the conversation. See you at GI.
So you all are familiar, most likely, with the current principles. Our current 7 principles begin with the words, we the member congregations of Unitarian Universalist Association covenant to affirm and promote. So let's start with what is a covenant. It is a promise we make to one another, how we treat each other, and how we show up in the world. When someone gets married, for example, their wedding vows are a covenant between a loving couple. And much like a marriage, our relationship relies on keeping our covenants with one another. When a covenant is broken, we must work to repair that relationship. Our principles, that is our covenant to one another. So how has this covenant changed over time? Again, Reverend Johnson will get into deeper. We don't have time to do that today, to go into the vast history of our principles between our two denominations. So this is just a very brief overview. Don't play again. There we go. Okay. So we started in 1961. Now, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged into one denomination in 1961, but there were two completely different sets of principles and sets of beliefs before they merged together. Now, much like every change in our principles, not everyone was happy with everything when this was finalized in 1961. But if you take anything away from this talk, what I want you to take, it's about the process before the principles. The 1961 merger was about us working together to find common ground. You had two groups with very different ideologies who formed a balance between their universal love of Christianity and the secular movement of reason. You can see a lot of similarities here to what would emerge in 1985. Between 1961 and 1985, we had several societal changes reflecting our changes in our values. Our faiths became more pluralistic in the denomination. The women's movement and civil rights demanded more equality in our language. The environmental movement was rising into our language as well. And so we changed our language to be more inclusive the second time around. This slide will look familiar to you. It is our current principles and purposes. You can see the language is more gender inclusive and adds our responsibility to our planet as well as to each other. One major change is that the religious language was separated out from the principles and put into a new section created, which are the 6 sources. This compromise with our growing diversity of beliefs outside of Christianity is to list some of them in their own section. Now let's take a deep breath at this point, because here's where the changes come. So take a deep breath. Change is coming. We can see that change is a big part of our covenant history. We are a living tradition, and as such, we want every generation to have a voice in our principles. Remember, it's about the process and before the principles. We are discussing how to move together into the 21st century. And a large catalyst for that movement began around 2013 with the beginning of the 8th principle movement. So what is the 8th principle? The 8th principle is journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Dr. Paula Cole-Jones wrote, after working with congregations on these issues for over 15 years, she realized that a person can believe they are being a good UU and following the 7 principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions at a systemic level. Her evidence is most UU congregations are primarily European American in membership and culture, especially in their music and leadership. Even when located near diverse communities, she realized that an 8th principle was needed to correct this. Let's hear a little more about this from Dr. Paula Cole-Jones.
Our request to consider the 8th principle was part of the catalyst for setting the Article 2 process in motion. There were some people early on that said, well, the 8th principle should be the preamble to the principles, or this is the only one that we really need, or, you know, there were a lot of different ways of looking at it, and the board was hoping that it would be more infused and not just an add-on at the end. So there are people had a lot of different thoughts about it. I have said all along that it's not likely to be an 8th principle when it gets to the national level. We knew that it would be rewritten. I said it's not likely to be an 8th principle, but it will definitely be in there. when congregations adopt the eighth principle locally, they have the eighth principle. So whatever is happening around them, whatever is happening at the congregations that are close by, whatever is happening nationally, you will have the eighth principle as a guide. If there ever were a time to think about both and, this is that time. If you need a real life example of both and, this is that time.
So yes, this is a both and moment. As stated earlier, it's about the process before the principles. Doing the work to understand how the eighth principle can strengthen us. Doing work to understand that our current principles are and how we can fully live them also helps us. It's about the process, not the principles. Many of us love our current principles, myself included. If you love them, you can keep them. Many people who love the principles in 1961 could still use those principles for themselves. We do not need to abandon those concepts with this change. If it's on your heart, keep them in your heart. But I would invite you to open your heart to change, to growth, and to hearing each other in covenant. So where are we in this process? I want to emphasize that all the changes you're about to see are very much still in the middle of the process. They've had changes before they got here, and what you're seeing now, and they're going to have changes after GA this year. So the Article 2 Commission submitted after lots of feedback and revisions and reported to GA for the board in January, the current process you see now. Forums are being held so they can discuss any changes. Amendments and changes are being proposed to be discussed at GA. Now, once we get to GA, which is in June, it's the 21st through the 25th, we are going to discuss the amendments proposed, and we're going to have a simple majority vote. Now, if that simple majority vote does not get through, then the process ends right there. If we do get a simple majority vote, then the proposal gets another year of revisions and discussion. Then in 2024, after all those revisions and all those discussions for another year have been added, it requires a 2/3 majority vote. A 2/3 of the delegations are needed to adopt the new Article 2. So no changes can be finalized in Article 2 until 2024 at the earliest. So now we've reached the moment. Another deep breath. Change is a-coming. Here is the proposed revision to Article 2. It is a reimagining of our principles. Again, Reverend Johnson will go into much more depth with all the history and all the changes and all the things that you're going to see. So we won't be doing much of that now. The full Article 2 is on the board in the social hall, and I also have packets at the back so you can look at them, you can compare them, and you can get to know the changes they have made. I will also share the link in our chat as well. This image has love in a chalice at the center with outstretched petals. Those petals are interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. Each of these words have a paragraph in there going into more detail, which includes similar language to our current 7 principles. The Commission has advised us to read through this a few times just to get a feeling for it. Look at it first without forming an opinion. Just feel it. Just sit with it. Then come back later and read it again. Take time to really process how we internalize change. Understand you may react strongly at first. I know I did. Be compassionate with yourself. Allow yourself to feel those emotions and breathe. As I said, it's about the process before the principles. Let's take our time and see what resonates. Remember, this is not final, and this is not an erasure of our principles. We are working together to grow into a new generation. For as they say, the times they are a-changin'. The biggest request for change comes from the 8th Principle movement, which asks for more verbs and more action phrases. It's good to affirm and promote, but the Commission asks us to add accountability to one another and action. What resonated most with me with this right here is looking at this picture is love at the center. Because when I think of my faith, it is always love at the center. Compassion and love and community. Love is my religion. All you need is love. Love is patient. Love is kind. May we be filled with loving kindness, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Love is how we show up in the world. But what does love mean? Our nominated UUA presidential candidate, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, was asked recently at a presidential forum what it means to her to center love. Here is her response.
One of the things in the Article 2 proposal, speaking of language, that a lot of folks have resonated with is this idea around centering love. Liberating love, the spiritual discipline of love, which is in the draft text. What does it mean to you to say that love is the center of our faith? And how might that help you find common ground, or us find common ground with our metaphorically diverse people?
That's a great question. To me, this is a great example of the work that remains to be done with Article 2. And I want to just pause and actually just thank the Article 2 Study Commission again. This has been an immense amount of work, and they're literally waiting for us to tell them whether we want them to do yet another immense amount of work. So I just want to say thank you. I think it's a powerful theological claim, and one that is, interestingly, I'm not going to say not controversial because, wow, I'm not trying to open that debate, but it feels less controversial. The love language from a theological perspective is so frequent in Unitarian Universalist personal expression, in our hymnody and sermons and, you know, stories, all the things. What I like about it is that it draws from our inherited theological tradition. So, you know, a love ethic is central to liberal Christianity. It simply is. We have expanded that, wrestled with it, kept parts of it. I mean, this is the work of a living tradition, but it does hold true to who we have been, which I think is really important in ways that still apply to who we are today. To me, that's part of what it means to be part of a tradition. So I love that it's part of our inherited teachings, but it's also broad enough to honor the kind of pluralism. And I keep using this word, so let me say out loud, I actually do not believe that Unitarian Universalists can believe anything, and that there's nothing at the center of our faith. That is not what I believe. I do think one of our primary values, to the point that we put it in our bylaws, which is somewhat odd. What do we choose to put values-wise and theologically in our rules? But our rules are clear, right, that room for pluralism must exist among us. That is a powerful, hard-earned value. So I want to distinguish between the two. But anyway, love leaves room for a pluralistic expression of what that asks. Right? And that's what I'm excited about. I'm also excited, I'm hoping that our religious educators and our theologians and our youth and our leaders of all kinds are going to spend next year digging into what it means. Right? We've been given this language set by the Article 2 Study Commission, but it comes with no RE curricula. There hasn't been any theological writing. We haven't told stories or written hymns or this. We have 30 years with our principles of that work having been done. And talking to beloveds who were part of the work in the 80s, were saying, there was no theology, there were no stories, there was no rainbow, that was a beautiful poster on the wall, and like, we're being invited into that work. I'm excited about a year-long preliminary conversation. What does love mean? And as I think about that, right, what does that ask of us in our relationality with each other? There are so many definitions of love. I'm not interested in all the Greek, you know, versions. That's not fair. But I don't think that's the point for us. I think the point is that we are saying something holds us in the spirit of how we are with one another that has a certain kind of character. And it may not be the same character for everyone, but it should be recognizable, right? So whether that for you is compassion, or it's right relationship, or it's respect, or it's open listening, or it's open-mindedness, or whatever, kindness, something, it should be recognizable as love to someone else in the community, right? Even if they don't have to mean the same things. And the other thing I like about this language of love is that I think it calls us to something larger than ourselves in how we make our way in the world. That also leaves room, right? Are you particularly called by that which is most impactful in human living, by ancestral tradition, by what you have known in your personal congregation about Unitarian Universalism, by your understanding of God, or whatever you hold holy? All of those things can be encapsulated by the idea of love calling us on. That's in one of our hymns, right? And so the question of how then do we hold a greater concept that leaves room for us to be who we are, as you use, but still holds us to something. I don't want to say that this is true for everyone. My experience through the pandemic was, did we do enough to give each other enough to hold on to when we had to be physically apart? Are we doing enough now that many of us still have to be physically apart? Have we done enough to respond to the backlash in the world coming out of collective trauma? And if we haven't, then we have more theological work to do. Yeah.
So there are several parts of Article 2 which we have not touched on in our talk today. One other to note is our inspiration section, which would replace the 6 sources. Our sources are not spelled out in the proposed version. Much like the principles, the Commission felt a list would always leave something out, and they wanted to be inclusive to everyone. As I said earlier, Reverend Johnson will go into this in much more depth than we will discuss. We just wanted to give you some familiarity in this talk today and talk about how change feels. I encourage everyone to read through the report and the proposed changes and just sit with the idea. Think of how it speaks to you and how it reflects the current generation rising. Think about how we're showing up in the world and how we are answering the call for greater justice, the call of centering love. Change is a difficult thing. As I said earlier, no one is called to abandon their principles. Just like all those who changed in 1961 and in 1985, if you love them, then they are yours. Hold them in love. But leave some room to welcome change as well. The Article 2 Commission says in their conclusion, we recognize the fact that the proposed version of Article 2 we have presented is indeed a significant departure from our current version, just as past changes to Article 2 were a significant change from their predecessors. The 1985 version, which first introduced these principles, was a radical change from the purposes and objectives of the previous version. We are continuing in the line of proposing changes that fits with the time that we live. We fully expect that one day another commission will review our work and significantly change it. We are writing this in pencil, not etching it in stone. They also go into a little bit about how it's a grieving process, and it's okay to grieve and to mourn when you're going into change. I'm going to leave you now with these closing words from the Article 2 Commission. This is from one of my favorite UU talk shows. It's called The View. It's brought to us by the Church of the Larger Fellowship, which is a virtual and mail-based ministry. And this is their interview with the Commission.
I'm preaching about this proposal in a couple of weeks. What's one thing that each of you hopes that I say in my sermon?
I hope you say it's the beginning of a process, the beginning of a process and not the end. Like, in other words,
It's kind of the middle of the process.
Well, yeah, but what I want to see is like people to vote yes this year, to give us a year to live with it, to live into it, to really embody it, to try it out for a year, to really know whether it works or not. You know, I think it does, but you know, we're just kind of presuming at this point. We're projecting, right? Let's try it for a year, and then it has to make that bigger vote next year. So that's the one thing I would want to, you know, kind of make sure is emphasized.
Good message. I think it's important that people see this as about the vibrancy of Unitarian Universalism going forward. This is a vision about our future.
I think it would be great if you reiterated how like how you like it and you like the embodiment that you felt, and just encourage people to sit with it and feel it.
Kathy, you're muted.
And I would certainly encourage people to, as Cheryl had recommended, and as we were recommending at the early stages of our work, how does it feel? And then what do you think? And then maybe what might you want to change? But really experience it deeply before you just start getting into the punctuation and the I like this word rather than some other word.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And Janine, I might try your Lectio Divina approach. I love, let's experience this as a sacred document for a minute and see how that feels to us.
Amen. Well, let us know how it goes. Thank you all so much for being with us today.
And I thank you all for listening to me, and I look forward to sharing in this process with all of you and learning new ways to center love. Thank you. Like how to apply. So I don't know if I have the best answer. I would say, how do you apply the 7 principles now? How does that apply to your life? How have you thought about that in terms of your own spirituality? And so that might be a good exercise, is to just kind of look at what we have now and see what rings true to you, what in our principles is important to you, and then go look at the new principles and see what in there is matching that and ringing true to you. What is important to you that's in the new principles? A lot of the language is very similar. I didn't read it because it's like I said, Reverend Johnson's going to go into a lot more of it, but a lot of the same phrases we use in the 7 principles are also found under those different words that I mentioned in the flower. And I just love a pretty flower, so I'm also kind of partial to that. But it's visually pleasing is what I'm saying. But yeah, a lot of that same language is in there, but it is a little more spelled out. And another thing that you're going to see changes is you're going to see things that are more like, we agree to do this rather than we affirm that we like this. Like that was one of the big things the commission talked about, is we want to hold each other more accountable to action and to show how we're showing up in the world in love, rather than just saying we really support a diverse community. How are we supporting a diverse community? That was one of the things they really wanted to emphasize. But as I said, we're in the middle of this process, so changes will be made. This will not be the final product. It may, and if it doesn't get a majority vote at GA, it won't go any farther than this, and we'll start the whole process over again. So this is part of the conversation. This is about us exploring what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. What does that mean to you? And this is one of those things where we're exploring, well, the words themselves will change over time, but what are the changes that are inherently important to us? What is it that is our core foundation? And that's what we're exploring.